Hi, I'm Paul J. Welcome to the theAnalysis.news podcast. And please don't forget there's a donate button at the top of the website. And if you're listening on a podcast, it would be nice if you went down to the very bottom or wherever reviews on whatever platform you're listening on are and leave a review. Of course, if you like what we're doing, it'd be nice if you left a good review. So this is the last segment of a series we've been doing on the report titled From Global Pandemic to Prosperity for All, Avoiding Another Lost Decade. That's produced by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and this is its 2020 report. And now joining us from Geneva to continue our conversation is the principal author of the report, Richard Kozul-Wright. He's the Director, Division of Globalization and Development Strategies at UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. There's a lot of words going on here. He's the author of Transforming Economies, Making Industrial Policy Work for Growth, Jobs, and Development. Thanks for joining me, Richard.
Nice to be back, Paul. We love acronyms in the United Nations. That's kind of our problem.
Yeah, I should just stick with the UNCTAD, but I have to explain what UNCTAD is at any rate. So if you're listening and you're just joining us, it probably would be good to go back and start from the first part of the series as we work our way through the report, because we're now at the end, and we're going to start talking about solutions. And the section's titled The Great Escape. There's a couple of parts to it. But the theme is Embrace Bold Ideas. So, Richard, start with that. What are the bold ideas presented in the report about what should be done about the current crisis? And just to add a little context, just before this chapter, you ended the previous section with this: the economic damages from rigging the rules of the game are not the end of the problem. The concentration of economic power is politically corrosive. National constitutions instruct legislatures to make and enforce the same rules for everyone, whether operating within or without a corporation. The response to the global financial crisis suggested otherwise. Banks were bailed out and austerity hit jobs, wages, public services, while financial asset holders made further gains from the recovery. So, Richard, when you make the proposals of what should be done, obviously you're saying, well, let's not do that. Because pre-pandemic, as you've argued in the course of our conversations, and as you said in the report, pre-pandemic, the global economy was already, I don't know if you could say crisis is the problem, but on the verge of one because of the enormous gap, growing gap in incomes and the enormous growth in inequality. So what should be done?
What we argued was that as a result of this failure to deal properly with the aftermath of the global financial crisis, we had this set of pre-existing conditions that were there before COVID struck, but have been in many respects worsened and exaggerated by the current crisis. So, this is the obvious ones. I mean, inequality, as you mentioned, is the one that people obviously talk about a lot. Very high levels of debt, not just public debt, but private debt and debt of households and students and corporations. Declining public services, very, very weak public investment across most of the developed world, but also private investment has been pretty static for a lot of this period. And behind this kind of growing power of the corporate sector, I mean, not just finance, but with finance somehow being typical of this kind of world of rent-seeking behavior, of repressed wages and weak aggregate demand. So, these are the pre-existing conditions I think have been exposed and exaggerated by COVID-19. So any strategy, at least as we understand it, that does recover better or builds back better in the language of the day hasn't only to deal with the immediate consequences of COVID-19, but if it's going to be effective, has to at the same time deal with these pre-existing problems that survive beyond 29 2010. So when we look at the kind of measures that we think are necessary, particularly in the developed world, but also in the developing world. And that distinction, obviously, we're going to have to talk about because there are obvious differences between developed and developing countries. And developing countries are a particular concern of UNCTAD, obviously. But, so we do believe very strongly that macroeconomic policy an active macroeconomic policy has a critical role in terms of responding to the current situation and as we've argued before, a much more prolonged fiscal expansion to complement unorthodox monetary policy has to be part of the policy package, with a very strong emphasis on employment creation and repairing social services. We talk a lot in the report about the need to strengthen the care economy as a central component of that, and that's, I guess, obvious in the context of the health pandemic we're going through. A particular emphasis, I think, on public investment infrastructure, repairing in the case of advanced economies infrastructure that has been degraded over decades, but also, and arguably more importantly, this need to use public investment to shift the energy mix away from carbon fuels to renewables of one kind or another. So, I mean, I think most people in one way or another that's a fairly familiar set of policies. People argue about the dimensions, but I think anyone in the progressive tradition would be pushing that. We want to go beyond that by insisting, for example, that you can't do the kinds of transition that we're talking about and build resilience without seeing some fairly significant structural changes in the economy. You need industrial policy to rate. Productivity has been sluggish across the Western world for some time now, and you're going to need industrial policy to be able to make the necessary shifts into higher productivity sectors and to boost skills in those sectors. So we make a big pitch for industrial policy as part of a kind of just and green transition. Obviously, a very strong pitch for the need for progressive tax reforms, not only of high wealth individuals, but also of corporations, moving away from indirect taxes, which tend to be highly regressive, towards direct taxation of those that are in a position to be able to pay and should be paying. And then I think critically for us, regulation of the financial sector. We've constantly made the argument that you can't have a progressive economic policy in a world where footloose capital is able to dictate the kind of pace and policy of economic change. And so the need for regulation, cutting down not only dealing with banks in a more effective way than was done after 2009, but in particular of the shadow banking sector that has mushroomed over the course of the last decade, private equity, insurance companies, etc. So it's that combination of reflation, redistribution, regulation that we associate with the New Deal, and we think needs to be revived and stoked in response to COVID-19, with a particular focus on addressing these pre-existing conditions that are holding back a more inclusive and sustainable future.
One of the recommendations you make is, I've been told, something that the corporate elite, the finance sector, is wildly opposed to. And that's a wealth tax. You write, in light of the further increase in inequality resulting from the crisis, the case for a wealth tax seems irrefutable. I once asked a friend who knows a lot of the Wall Street people what they thought of Sanders and Warren. And I said, if they had to choose between a Warren or Sanders and a Trumpist kind of authoritarianism, if even some people use the word fascism, what would they choose? And he says, well, if Warren and Sanders are serious about a wealth tax, they choose a Trump or a Trump type. The wealth tax, though, isn't it kind of the only way to get at the serious money? So you guys must have talked about whether to include this or not, and concluded you would. So what was your thinking on the issue of that a wealth tax seems irrefutable?
I mean, when we talk inequality, obviously people talk about the 1% versus the 99%, and it's usually a focus on household incomes, and we know the shifts that have taken place in that area over the last 3 or 4 decades, although not so much over the last couple of decades. Income inequality has not really been. I mean, the real shifts in income inequality occurred in the 80s and the 90s in most advanced economies. I mean, we usually pad that out with a discussion of functional income and the shift and the relationship between wages and profits, which most conventional economics and most conventional policymakers tend to ignore. Although that's you can see there's been a relentless decline in the wage share in most advanced economies, not all, but most advanced economies, that is quite significant over the last 3 or 4 decades. So that, which is why we think a focus on wages and how to strengthen wages is particularly important when it comes to the redistribution story. But at the same time, we've had these because of the nature of of 21st century capitalism, which is driven by incessant financial deal making and asset price rises. The degrees of wealth inequality now have just become obscene to a point that we haven't really seen probably certainly in the post-war era, and arguably some people would argue even before that. And so tackling that problem seems to us to just be an obvious part of the economics of inequality. But it goes back also to the point that you made about this kind of vicious circle between economic power and wealth and political power and influence. And there's a term that, funnily enough, a Chicago economist, Zingales, coined, which we do like, which is to refer to this relationship, this incestuous relationship between economic and political power, as a Medici vicious circle, kind of conjuring up the images of 15th, 16th century Florence and the Italian Renaissance. And so this accumulation of wealth of assets and rising asset prices, which lies behind that, it seems to be intimately connected with the ability to capture political power, and the idea that of Zingales, a Chicago-based economist, of a Medici vicious circle, kind of drawing on the Florentine state of the 14th, 15th century, where you had this kind of powerful interlocking of economic and financial wealth, seems to describe very closely the state of affairs in the 21st century. And we know this. Your colleagues like Tom Ferguson have shown the extent to which politics have been and policy making has been captured by small elites in certainly in the United States. I think it applies beyond the United States too. So I think tackling the not just the economic side of it, but the political side of that inequality story strikes us as being central to rebalancing the body politic and being able to forge a more kind of inclusive and sustainable future. So in that context, how you deal with this massive accumulation of wealth and how you begin to tackle that is, we think, is central to the story. And we can see it in the pandemic. I think the recent figure for the growing wealth of U.S. billionaires since COVID COVID-19 hit is something like 840 billion, I think was a figure I saw from the Institute for Policy Studies. In a time when economies are collapsing, these people's wealth is mushroomed, and it's based upon, as we know, the ability of asset prices to sustain themselves during this crisis.
Yeah, I think there used to be, as the American state and post World War II, European states emerged and matured, and I guess you could say FDR in the 30s was even the best representative of what I'm about to say in the United States, that the role of government and the state is to look after the longer term systemic interests of capitalism and the capitalist class and the elites. I mean, which means there has to be some compromise with working people for the sake of the system. And FDR's New Deal clearly was, he didn't want the United States to gravitate towards socialism. The Soviet Union, for better or worse, looked like it had full employment and so on. So there was pressure that not to go towards fascism. There had to be a kind of New Deal. But that idea that the state and government looked after the longer term class interests of the elites seemed to get more and more eroded post World War II, to the point where it's as you get into the 1990s, it's like considered, I think, naive that the finance, the corporate sector, and thus their political representatives should be worried about anything other than the short-term return for finance and the corporate sector. And I don't think we should even talk about these two things as separate, in the sense that if you look at who owns the corporate sector, it's mostly financial institutions. And in almost every case, financial institutions either directly own or through asset managers like BlackRock indirectly own, but do control the shares of all the big publicly owned companies. So I don't even think you can talk about a separate corporate and finance sector anymore. But my main point is, like, Trump is like the culmination of this, the most banal, self-serving, narrow self-interest in the state itself. And to forget the state playing the role of doing what's good for the system.
There's always been that argument in progressive forces that there's a conflict between kind of industrial capitalist interests and financial capitalist interests, right? There's a long-standing debate about that, and I think that's probably true still in many developing countries too. That potential conflict between industrial capital and finance capital. And I think you're right, though. One of the features of this financialization process has been the much greater coincidence of interest between what we think of as the financial sector and industrial capital in its modern forms, and part of that is the kind of crisscrossing of ownership that you've described, but also the evolution of industrial capital, in which things like brands and monopoly positions, intellectual property rights have become the basis on which profit making is made in pharmaceutical sectors, in audiovisual. So there's been. I think it's true that the interest between industrial and finance capital have become much more intertwined in the advanced economies under this world of hyperglobalization. Although I think it's probably less true in much of the developing world.
So if the state governments in most of the advanced capitalist countries, and certainly most exaggerated in the United States, is such that it's not just that it's hard to tell the difference between corporate and financial interest, it's hard to find some space between corporate/financial interest and the government anymore. It's not like politics in the United States was ever, for a single day, not dominated by the interests of the elites. But as the state matured, and particularly under FDR, there was a role carved out for the state to make sure the system survived. And one of the threats to the system was a grossly exaggerated inequality. And FDR with the New Deal tried to address that. That to a large extent, that kind of consciousness seems to be so subordinate in the elites. It's practically marginal. And so when you talk about what kind of reforms are possible in terms of what you've proposed, how do you see that kind of playing out? Where do you see signs, even amongst the elites themselves, that they actually need a state? And I'm talking, I think more about the United States, because I think at least in some countries of Europe, maybe they get it a little more. Maybe that's an illusion. I don't know. But that the government needs to play a kind of modifying role and not just be there to serve, a banquet to finance.
I mean, I think that's, in that sense, I think that is the greatest challenge, right? In terms of how it's possible to forge progressive alliances that can push this kind of agenda against what appears to be such a concentrated degree of economic wealth and political power. And there is obviously a difference. I mean, when you look at and you probably know this much better than I do, Paul. But, you look at the New Deal, the people in the New Deal, I mean, it included people like Marion Eccles, right, who was himself a kind of banker. I mean, Roosevelt himself and Morgenthau, is Treasury Secretary, came from that patrician class of upstate New York, right, or wherever they were. So, I mean, and that you don't really see many of those types around today. I think that's certainly the case. But there is, there's clearly a growing opposition within the elite to the concentration of power, for example, in digital corporations. So these digital giants have kind of shifted from being paragons of virtue and a bountiful future to being problems, right? So you'll get something like the Financial Times as to some extent, a mouthpiece of the establishment, worrying extensively about this concentration of power in the digital platforms, and you can see that's become a bit, in the United States, this issue of the concentration of power has clearly become a cross-party issue. You got people like Rubio, right? Worrying about these kinds of issues. So I mean, there are clearly signs that within the establishment that things have gone too far.
Let me just add to what I said, which is the big problem right now is what the hell's the alternative? Because when you you put in the time frame of the climate crisis, there is just no sign of a kind of really conscious, progressive, national people's movement in any country I look at that can actually get positioned to actually get elected and run one of the major countries, or minor countries for that matter. Like if some of these kinds of people in the elites don't emerge, who get the gravity of the crisis in a Rooseveltian way. I know they're only going to do it to save capitalism, but if they can deal with the climate crisis, hoping to save capitalism along the way, well then, good on them. But I think and this is the conundrum. I think the factors. Let me back up a step. We're all in mixed economies here. All the major capitalist countries, and maybe every country in the world, more or less, is a mixed economy. Even Cuba these days. You have socialistic-y aspects of the economy and capitalistic private aspects, and in most countries, the private capitalists are certainly dominant, and in China maybe it's a little different, and it's somewhat unique and more complicated, China. But my point is, in the United States and all the other Western capitalist countries, I don't see how you deal with the climate crisis without an enormous strengthening of the socialistic characteristics of the economy, which will necessarily include some kind of democratization and people's movement, and or some sections of the elites that get that that's the only way out of this. And Roosevelt, like I said, was out to save capitalism, talked about the importance of public ownership, that when a sector of the economy is vital and the private interests that are operating in that sector either can't make it affordable or can't run it properly or kind of blackmail the society with it, then they should be nationalized. They should be publicly owned. And one of the critiques of the UNCTAD report, your report, is that you don't raise that in this report. And let me just read you a guy who, he writes critically of UNCTAD, a guy named Michael Roberts, who used to work in finance, I think, in London. And he wrote, UNCTAD's structural policies boil down to more regulation of monopolies and banks, not taking them over. And he says, UNCTAD presents a whole range of green measures to curb and control global warming, but there's no call for public ownership of the fossil fuel industries, and they're phasing out. So my question, doesn't this issue of public ownership need to be raised as in the way Roosevelt raised it? I mean, even within the capitalist framework. And I would just add to that, there's just no way to counter the power of the big financial institutions without I don't think it can be done through regulation. They just don't allow it to happen. So you wind up needing public banking on a scale that breaks the blackmail. And also on this issue of fossil fuel, I don't know how you phase out fossil fuel if you don't seriously weaken them, which is essentially buy them.
I think these are the big questions, but just step back a bit, though. I mean, it's interesting that you would use the term mixed economy. I mean, when I was growing up a long time ago, but in the 70s, the use of the term mixed economy was prevalent everywhere, right? Most people would be comfortable referring to advanced capitalist economies as mixed economies. The term mixed economy has essentially disappeared from the lexicon of discussions about modern economies. People don't use that term anymore, and so we've moved away, I think, from that kind of Rooseveltian idea. And Roosevelt, I don't think the U.S., although it was part of the discussion in the U.S., there was very little public ownership, right, in the New Deal agenda, in the way that we had in the United Kingdom with the nationalization of the utilities and the coal mines, etc.
Yeah, no, it was nothing comparable to the UK, but and I'm no expert on this, but there was a fight over the electrical sector, and that the electrical companies were monopolizing things. And they were, extorting very high fees for electricity and so on. So Roosevelt really started pushing public ownership, and I think the Hoover Dam was an example of it. Never on the scale of the UK or even Canada, for that matter.
I think it's true that Hoover used those kinds of ideas that were part of the New Deal in the discussion in the run-up to the election of 32 to brandish Roosevelt as a closet Bolshevik, right, which you hear in election discussions to this day. But I mean, it was not central to the U.S. New Deal. I don't think. But I still think it's true that the regulatory changes and the strengthening of organized labor, which were clearly central to to Roosevelt's New Deal, did shift the economic structures towards this idea of a mixed economy, absent the role of public ownership. I mean, it's not that public ownership was a great success in the United Kingdom, as we know. Now, that's not to say that I do think ownership questions are critical. I do think there's a very strong case to be made for public ownership, and particularly public ownership of the financial, of large parts of the financial sector. If you think of finance as a utility, as some people do, then the best way to deal with that, I think, is through public ownership. I mean, and after all, of course, central banks remain either directly or indirectly, public institutions, right? I think part of the problem is that they've been captured by financial interests, as other parts of the state structures have been captured by private interests in various ways. So, but I still think it, and so there's a discussion to be had. There's a very important discussion to be had about non-state forms of progressive ownership, the use of cooperatives, and again, something we've talked about in previous reports, as being an alternative form of organizing production that I think should be in the mix of discussions of structural reforms. So I don't think we rule those. I don't think we rule those out of the discussion. I think you have to have a serious discussion about the ways in which publicly owned enterprises have, not been very successful in terms of delivering the services or indeed the product that they are, that in the sectors that the public ownership takes hold. So, I think there's a serious discussion to be had there, but I don't think we rule out ownership, public ownership as part of a progressive strategy. I just think it should be nestled in ultimately with issues around redistribution and regulation, where I suspect, at least in the current context, it's probably easier to get traction in the Western world than discussing those issues. But there are these issues of sovereign wealth funds, right? People like Yanis Varoufakis have put forward, serious ideas about the way in which you can shift ownership patterns by using a certain amount of profits to be channeled into certain types of ownership schemes. These should be part of the discussion. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
You talk about a Marshall Plan for global health recovery. What would that look like?
Yeah, this is where we begin to shift away from issues or the kind of strategies of advanced economies to the particular problems of developing countries. We would argue that, and we are strong advocates of a Green New Deal type strategy to address the problems around economic injustice and environmental breakdown. So that's a strategy that we would want to push and promote. And the policy ingredients of the Green New Deal, I think, are what I've said. Expansionary macroeconomic policy, strong use of public investment, use of public banks, progressive taxation, industrial policy. There's no, the ingredients of a Green New Deal, I think, policy ingredients at least, are pretty much the same. The problem for developing countries is that they have these long-standing and yet unresolved development problems that most developed countries no longer face, right? Problems of the informality of their workforce, lack of diversification of their economies, extreme vulnerability to external shocks, whether natural or financial, and this puts developing countries in a particularly difficult position when it comes to designing the kinds of policies that can address economic and environmental combined economic and environmental challenges. And so, UNCTAD was set up on the grounds that these countries require supportive international action, financial, technological, technical support, if they are going to be able to kind of put together the policy packages that can deliver on these various economic, social, environmental fronts. So and that remains as true today as it did back in 1964 when UNCTAD was established, when the world economy was less financialized, where they were much more dependent on commodities, which were highly rigged markets in favor of advanced economies, etc. And we would argue that financialization has made the lives of many developing countries all the more difficult, piling up of debt, particularly short-term debt, vulnerability to financial shocks of one kind or another, capital flight, major gyrations in their exchange rates, etc. So in the world that we see now, we believe that the multilateral system that has evolved post 1980 has essentially evolved against the interests of most, not all, of course, and there are some obvious exceptions, but most developing countries. So when it comes to responding to the COVID-19 shock, where the health shock has been compounded by, a very predictable set of economic shocks that we saw hit developing countries, particularly immediately after the pandemic began in March and April. The multilateral system, particularly the multilateral financial institutions, have failed abysmally to provide the kind of support that people like Roosevelt and Keynes and Harry Dexter White thought that the multilaterals that they were putting into place 75 years ago would be designed to do. Right. So we've seen, even though developing countries are facing these huge debt problems, many of them at the moment, the kinds of things that have been offered by the G20 and the IMF and World Bank are just insignificant compared with the financial stresses that many of these countries are now facing. So we then go back, as we've done with the New Deal, to the kinds of thinking that was present back in the late 40s about how you can provide finance to build back better for countries under serious financial difficulties. And the classic case there is the Marshall Plan, of course, aimed differently than, because it was aimed at other advanced economies. But on the scale, in the case of the Marshall Plan, the original Marshall Plan, something like 1% of US GDP was channeled to Europe on an annual basis between 1948 and 1952, that put these countries back on their feet. When we wind the clock forward 75 years, developed countries who have promised to give developing countries 0.7% of their GDP in the form of overseas development assistance for decades have never been able to push that figure above 0.3% on average. There are exceptions. The Scandinavian countries and stuff have tended to meet that target. So we need to see a multilateral system that delivers on the promises on which it was set up, which is to provide predictable, stable, cheap, long-term finances, possibly in the form of grants, to developing countries, particularly in the face of the kind of severe shock that they are now facing as a consequence not only of the health pandemic, but of the response of the advanced economies through lockdown to, closing down export markets, stopping remittances, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea of a global Marshall Plan really kind of goes back to that original intent of the multilateral system and tries to link it to the particular challenges facing developing countries today.
And the argument for doing it is the same argument post-World War II, which was that actually reviving the global economy is good for all countries on the globe, including the United States. Although given the nationalist fervor, not just from the Trump side, but even Biden pushing, everything buy American, that's going to be his big campaign promise. It seems to be going the other way. Let me end by asking you maybe the biggest question in some ways. Throughout the report, there are references that whatever policy and reform one's talking about, it needs to take into account and be connected to policies that deal with the climate crisis. And there seems like there's this, pretty awful paradox here. When you look at anything possible through market mechanisms, and most government policy these days, even the recommendations of the Biden campaign on climate, rely on either carbon capture and market mechanisms, either whether it's a tax on carbon or cap and trade policies and such. Whereas the need, if one's going to meet any of the benchmarks set by scientists of not crossing 1.5 degrees global warming, which now I don't think there's much doubt we're going to cross, but certainly not hitting 2, although the course we're on, I don't know how we don't hit 2. All that being said, there needs to be serious government intervention, serious regulations, serious government investment in green infrastructure, and dealing with phasing out fossil fuel, not just carbon capture, which seems so untested, which leads to all very socialistic policies. As go back to this mixed economy discussion, it means greatly shifting the balance from the private sector so in control to a far more socialized economy, which to quote Bernie Sanders, requires some kind of political revolution. How do you see this playing out? Because we don't have much time.
The language of the mixed economy, right, back after the Second World War, was not a language of socialism, right? Really, it was in the way you've described it. But given the extreme shift in most advanced economies to this kind of adulation and infatuation with markets, that anything that involves the state coming back in, which is, you're right, everything we say involves the state coming back in a significant way, that's absolutely inevitable, is somehow immediately deemed socialistic. So, I mean, that's a reflection of a sad reflection of the way in which advanced capitalist economies have evolved, I think, over the last 4 decades of kind of neoliberal thinking. We make the argument that a kind of shift to public investment of 2 to 3, arguably, I would argue more, 4% a year over the next decade is the minimum that we need to be able to shift certainly the energy mix to meet the kinds of targets that have been set by Paris. And we don't believe that private finance can do that job. There's no evidence that we see this. And within my world of multilateral institutions, the whole language is about how you get private finance to deliver on these public goods. I mean, the climate being the most pressing one, but other public goods, including public services as well. And there's just no evidence to back this kind of story up. And the various attempts to do it through public-private partnerships and blended finance techniques, in many respects make the situation worse rather than better. So the big challenge then is, well, how can you finance a big public investment push of the kind that we are talking about? And to some extent, there's a feeling that it always the argument. So, we heard it immediately after the great financial crisis. Where's the money? The governments don't have the money for this kind of stuff, and to some extent, our friends in the modern monetary theory tradition have begun to erode that kind of logic, and certainly the behavior of governments in response to the COVID-19, as before in response to the global financial crisis, have to some extent undermined that idea that governments don't have access to money. But you look at also others. I mean, if the United States, in a funny way, all you're arguing for is a return to the tax structure in the United States that Richard Nixon was comfortable with, right? If you simply went back to that kind of tax structure, you would generate trillions of dollars, additional dollars available for government spending. And then you go into these issues of subsidy. You mentioned them yourself, subsidies for fuel subsidies. The IMF estimates that fossil fuel subsidies around the world can be upwards of $500 billion. Huge subsidies to agricultural sector, which itself is a major contributor to warming temperatures. And so it does require governments to roll, not to essentially recapture some of the resources that we would see are being wasted in this highly financialized, highly unequal, highly concentrated world, to be able to fund the kind of transition, public investments, retraining, etc., that we think are the basis of a genuine Green New Deal. And to do that at the global level would also mean ensuring that resources of a similar nature were being made available to developing countries as well. And you know, a lot of what we say when we look at the numbers are based upon experiences in countries in the not too distant past, right? I mean, the kind of investment push that we've modeled in some of our work is based upon numbers from the 1990s. So it's not like it's this kind of impossible dream that we're talking about. It's one that we think is based upon reasonably sensible, realistic parameters that we have seen in our own lifetimes.
Thanks very much for joining us, Richard.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the theAnalysis.news podcast. And again, please don't forget at the top of the webpage, there's a donate button if you like what we do. And if you've already donated, thanks very much.